welcome. Tonight we're stepping into a world of candlelit tents, whispering crowds, dusty wagons and velvet curtains, to explore the quiet, sometimes heartbreaking, and deeply human lives of those who were once called freaks. From medieval marketplaces to grand Victorian circuses, from palace courts to traveling sideshows, we'll uncover why life behind the curtain was far more difficult and far more real than the posters ever let on. So if you enjoy this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling about the forgotten parts of history, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know. And before you get too sleepy, feel free to comment down below. Tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time is it right now where you are. Now let's begin. It is late evening, in a damp stone village somewhere in England, perhaps in the year 1286. The sun has dipped low behind the thatched rooftops, casting long orange shadows across muddy pathways. The scent of roasted onions and spilled ale lingers in the cool air, and a distant flute squeals gently as the local fiddler prepares for the night's entertainment. This evening, the townsfolk are especially eager, because something curious has arrived. The traveling performers have rolled into the village square with carts squeaking under the weight of crude wooden crates and velvet-covered platforms. And tucked between the usual jugglers and puppet acts is a different sort of display, something not of skill, but of strangeness, something the villagers call wonders of nature. A woman with a beard like a blacksmith, a boy no taller than a stool, a man with a curved spine and eyes that blink out of sync. They do not call it a freak show yet. That word is still centuries away. Here it's simply the Marvel tent, where the odd are gathered and pointed at with wide-eyed awe and nervous laughter. But if you stepped beyond the oiled canvas, if you waited long enough for the lanterns to dim and the crowds to shuffle off, you'd find someone sitting alone on a wooden crate. His name? Let's say he's called Iwan. They call me the crooked man, he might say, voice low and steady. Because my back bends like a question mark. Born like this, I was. Never did walk straight. I was 8 when the tanner told my mother, let the boy work the bellows or the forest'll take him. But I couldn't even lift the hammer without gasping. He pauses, staring into the fire. So I joined the Marvels. Better to be stared at for coin than pitied for free. Iwan is not bitter, not tonight. Tonight the hay beneath him is warm from the campfire, and the laughter outside has softened to murmurs. But he remembers what it's like when the flaps open, and the villagers shuffle in, eyes wide, some giggling, others crossing themselves. One child asked if he was cursed, another tried to poke him with a stick. He is not allowed to speak during the show. Just sit, look odd, that's all. In medieval Europe, the idea of physical difference was tangled with religion, superstition, and myth. A body that defied the expected form was not just strange, it was spiritual. You were either a divine omen or a devil's mistake, and both interpretations were terrifying. Deformity was not understood scientifically. There were no medical terms for scoliosis, hydrocephalus, or dwarfism, not in common circles, at least. Instead, people relied on folklore. A man with extra fingers might be seen as a sign from God. A woman with a large birthmark might be thought to carry a demon under her skin. They were feared, avoided, or just as often displayed. Noble courts, especially in France, Spain, and England, sought out dwarfs and fools for entertainment. Some were gifted musicians or sharp-witted jesters. Others were simply there to amuse with their appearance alone. To be different was to be owned, in a way. One chronicler from the 14th century records a dwarf gifted to a duke in Burgundy as a gesture of goodwill. The dwarf, only known in record as Tommelin, was described as a courteous and nimble fellow, yet small as a hawk perched on the arm. He was dressed in scarlet and gold, and placed beside the duke's own children during meals. But when the feast ended, Tommelin did not retire to a chamber like the others. He slept in a box by the hearth, with the dogs. That was the nature of it, half jester, half pet. Back in the village, the Marvel tent is taking in copper coins at a steady rate. The showman, a stout man with red cheeks and a well-oiled beard, claps and waves at the crowd. Come one, come all, see nature's mistakes, God's curiosities, the humbling truth of your own fortune. People laugh, some cringe, a few look away. Inside Iwan sits, hands folded in his lap. His spine aches from the ride, and the new tunic they've given him itches terribly. But he does not flinch. He learned long ago that the more still he sits, the more intense the crowd's gaze becomes. Sometimes, the gaze is worth more than the coin. Occasionally someone in the crowd isn't laughing. A gentle-eyed baker's wife, a small boy too nervous to speak. They look at him and seem to wonder, not what he is, but who he is. It's those rare looks that keep him going. That and the thought that tomorrow they'll be gone, and he'll still be here, still alive, still part of the show. Elsewhere in Europe, things are harsher. In the Holy Roman Empire, there were roving collections of monstrous births, fetuses in jars, two-headed pigs, skeletons with twisted spines, and occasionally live people. These collections were part science, part shock value. Some were paraded through towns by monks who warned of divine punishment, while others were sold from town to town by enterprising scholars. One such woman, Brigitte of Mainz, was born with a double row of teeth. Local legend claimed she could bite through iron. She could not. But the story made her popular. She toured monasteries and universities, held up by rope like a tapestry. Her contract forbade her from speaking during sermons. She died at 30, buried with a note on her grave. A miracle of God, misunderstood. What made these people freaks wasn't just their bodies, it was the way others reacted to them. The hunger to stare, the impulse to explain, the need to categorize, and always, the need to own the narrative. You see, there was no freedom in being strange during the medieval age. Not really. You were either hidden away or put on display, rarely in between. Those who performed in these early exhibitions didn't always get to choose. Some were sold to showmen by desperate parents. Others were rescued from villages by monks who claimed it was for their own good. And a few, like Iwan, chose the stage over starvation. But choice is a strange thing when the alternatives are few. Let's return to Iwan now. The show has ended. The coins have been counted. The fires are dying low. Outside the tent, someone is snoring, probably the juggler. And Iwan is curling beneath a woolen blanket that smells of smoke and goat. He's not angry, not tonight, just tired. They'll ask again tomorrow, he mutters to the stars. Why I'm shaped like a twist of dough, why God made me this way, why I don't stand straight like a knight or a priest. He smiles, and I'll say nothing. I'll let them wonder, let them marvel. The night continues. The world is quiet, and somewhere, a man who's been called a monster drifts softly into sleep. No less human than you or I. The flickering torchlight of the medieval village fades into marble halls and gilded mirrors. We leave behind the muddy straw of market squares and step carefully into the polished floors of noble courts. It's still the Middle Ages, but the world is changing. Kingdoms are growing richer, thrones are heavier with gold, and in the echoing chambers of castles, curiosity is becoming a sign of wealth. To own something rare is to be powerful. And in these circles, nothing was rarer than a human who defied nature. The dwarfs, the hunchbacks, the wild children, and those with unusual voices, strange proportions or curious limbs, they are no longer simply stared at in tents. No, now they are invited into court, or rather summoned. In France, Italy, Spain, and England, royals developed a fascination with what they called natural wonders. These were people whose bodies or behaviors stood out from the norm, either from birth, illness, or accident, and to the aristocracy, they were not pitied, they were collected. In the 14th and 15th centuries, court dwarfs became especially fashionable. They weren't seen as freaks in the crude sense, more like elegant curiosities. Status symbols, kings and queens paraded them as if they were living gems. The smaller the person, the greater the intrigue. There's a famous painting by Diego Velázquez, court painter to King Philip IV of Spain, showing a dwarf named Sebastián de Mora. He sits alone, not smiling, hands on knees, a furrowed brow. His face is tired, not just with age, but with performance. It's not a portrait of a jester or fool. It's a portrait of a man who is deeply, clearly human. But even among the grandeur, life was complicated. Let us meet one such figure now. We'll call her Isabetta. My name is Isabetta del Mora. Born under a bad star, they said. I came into this world with legs shorter than my arms, and a chest that puffed like a pigeon's. At 5 my parents dressed me in brocade, and brought me to a baron who liked to host unusual suppers. I was taught to dance, not well but uniquely. My skirts jingled. My shoes were curled like a jester's, even when I was not joking. At 12 I was sent to the Medici court. They placed me next to the youngest daughter of the Duke. Her new shadow, they called me. But I was no shadow. I was always visible, always looked at, never quite seen. Isabetta lived in splendor, soft pillows, gold-plated combs, honey cakes at breakfast. But the splendor came with a price: performance. She was expected to amuse, to surprise, to enchant the guests with her peculiarity, not with wit or song, just by being. This was the strange paradox of the court dwarf: elevated, admired, well-fed, but still not free. In some cases, dwarfs became beloved companions. They were baptized, given noble titles, and even left inheritances, but they were also ridiculed during feasts, thrown onto banquet tables to wrestle ducks, painted in comedic poses, or gifted to other nobles as if they were fine wine or a rare book. In Tudor England, King Henry VIII had several dwarfs at court. One, a woman named Jane, was so beloved by Princess Mary that she followed her mistress into exile. Jane was said to be clever and outspoken, but during banquets, she was still expected to dance for nobles, and even sit on silver trays brought out for laughs. Imagine that, a person sitting on a tray, surrounded by jewels and laughter not meant for her. Still, there were moments of comfort. At night, the jesters and dwarfs would gather in the smaller wing of the castle, the servants' wing, though they didn't quite belong there either. They were in between, not servants, not family, just curiosities. They would eat stews and crusty bread, share riddles, mend their small coats in silence. And when the moonlight slanted through the window slits, they would lie on tiny mattresses and drift off to dreams, just like anyone else. One such night, we hear Isabetta again. I remember the winter of my 15th year. Snow fell in fat clumps against the stained glass windows. The Duchess's son gave me a comb of mother of pearl. Said it was for my gleaming curls, though I think it was just to make the guests laugh. Still, I kept it. I brushed my hair every night with it, not because of what it meant to him, but because I liked the sound it made. A soft whisper through my curls. It was one of the few things that belonged only to me. Elsewhere in Europe, other freaks took on more dramatic roles. The Holy Roman Emperors were known to host grotesque feasts, in which people with unusual conditions were brought out between courses. A giant of Flanders might bring in the roast pig. A mute boy with eyes of different colors would play the harp. Dwarfs would race snails across the polished banquet table. To the nobles, it was harmless amusement. To the performers, it was survival. And yet there were always whispers of rebellion. In some courts, the jesters were the only ones who could speak freely. Hidden beneath their humor was sharp observation. A hunchbacked fool might say the king's belly grows fat with gold but lean with wisdom, and be met with laughter instead of execution. The fool was sacred, protected by absurdity. In that way, some of these performers became more powerful than they seemed. They could insult, joke, even reveal secrets, but always with a crooked smile. Not all lived in castles. Some served in noble households, paraded at weddings or funerals. Others traveled from manor to manor, offering services of wonder like trained animals. And when they were no longer interesting, when their deformities became familiar, or their tricks grew dull, they were dismissed. Often with a single coin. No home, no pension. Just gone. Let's pause here. In the cold twilight of a forgotten courtyard, a jester with one eye and a limp sits on a low stone wall. His hat bells are still. The fire inside the hall is far away now. They called me Patch, he says, because my coat was patchy and my thoughts were worse. I made the Duke laugh once, and he kept me another year. I made him frown once and I was gone by morning. He coughs, a weak gravelly sound. But in between, oh, I lived. I drank cherry wine. I kissed a scullery maid. I stole a goose and blamed it on the hound. They laughed. Always laughed. It wasn't a bad life, he sighs, except when it was. He leans back against the wall and closes his one eye. The snow falls lightly, and somewhere in the distance, a lute plays a slow, soft tune. The grand courts may have had gold-rimmed goblets and tapestries woven with silver thread, but outside their walls, across forests and farmland, another world was blooming. It smelled of sawdust, smoke, and horses. Its soundtrack was a symphony of fiddles, clanging bells, barkers shouting into the wind, and children squealing with sticky hands. This was the world of the traveling fair, and in it, the freak show found a new home. By the late medieval period, and into the early modern era, roads were becoming busier, towns more connected. Trade was blooming, even if slowly, and wherever wagons went, wherever markets formed, Entertainers followed, musicians, jugglers, acrobats, and among them the marvels, gone were the jeweled halls of noble courts. The new stage was a folding platform nailed to the side of a cart, draped with cloth dyed in faded reds and blues. Instead of royal audiences, the performers now faced butchers, bakers, and children with turnip peels on their breath. This was rougher, harsher, sometimes freer, but not easier. The showmen, often called curiosity men, scoured the countryside looking for people who looked unusual. Some were born with differences, some had scars from plague or war, some had simply grown old in strange ways, and had no place else to go. They were offered food, shelter, and a share of the profits. They were also offered nicknames: the Turtle Boy, the Angel with no arms, the Walking Bone, the Devil's Daughter, the Living Gnome. Let us ride in a creaking wooden wagon tonight, pulled by two tired horses named Windle and Birch. The wheels groan, the wind rustles through canvas. Inside 6 performers rest. One of them is Elias, a man whose spine curves so severely he cannot lie flat. He sleeps curled in a bundle of cloaks and straw. At every stop he becomes the Serpent Man. They think I was cursed by a snake in the cradle. Elias murmurs one night to his fellow traveler, a woman with 6 fingers on each hand. Let them think that. I'd rather be a legend than a burden. By the roadside campfires flicker. Someone is frying apples in a pan with lard. The smell is sweet, warm. The ground is damp, but not miserable. It is a small comfort. Traveling performers lived hard but close. The troupe became family. No one asked about your past. What mattered was tonight's crowd, and whether the rain would hold off long enough to earn some coin. They arrived in town before sunrise. The showman would speak to the mayor or town guard, sometimes bribing, sometimes begging for permission to set up in the square. And when the sun was high, and the bells tolled noon, the show began. A curtain pulled back, and out stepped a man with skin like cracked leather, his face darkened by years of sun and soot. He bowed deeply, then lifted a weight with his teeth. The indestructible. Next came a girl no taller than a jug, wearing a flower crown, who recited poetry and smiled wide enough to reveal a missing front tooth. The petal pixie. Then with a dramatic clang of cymbals, came Elias, dragged on stage like a limp puppet. He unraveled himself slowly, joints popping, until he stood like a question mark carved from oak. The Serpent Man, the showman cried, able to fold into a barrel, feared by shepherds, envied by gods. The crowd gasped, coins clinked, bread crusts were dropped. A few crossed themselves. Backstage, Elias drank warm beer and rubbed his knees. Another day, another crowd. These weren't glamorous shows. There were no velvet curtains or trained orchestras. Sometimes there wasn't even a roof, just tarps, hay, and the press of people. But in their own strange way, these troupes found meaning, a place where difference was not only accepted, but needed. Still, the road took its toll. Rain ruined costumes, roads broke wheels, fires started accidentally in wagons full of straw, and worst of all, the towns that didn't want you. There were places where villagers chased them out with pitchforks, where priests called them demons, where children threw rocks instead of flowers. One man, called Tobias the Giant, was refused food in 5 towns in a row because of rumors that he had stepped over a church without bowing. He was 7 feet tall with a booming laugh and a gentle heart, but in some places that was all it took to be feared. He died quietly in the back of a wagon, near a river crossing in the autumn of 1612. His companions buried him by torchlight and carved a simple plank. Here lies Tobias, tallest among us. May he rest without whispers. There was no applause that night, only the hush of the river and the soft snores of the horses. The freak show on the road was not a cruel business by nature, but it was, like much of history, a mirror. It reflected the world's curiosities and its cruelties. The people in the wagons were not monsters. They were not playthings. They were wanderers, workers, survivors. Sometimes they even found love. A dwarf named Matilda, known in the shows as the Button Maid, once married a strong man who could bend horseshoes with his fists. They were an odd pair. She barely reached his waist, but they adored each other. They slept in the same bunk, ate from the same bowl, and shared the same laugh that echoed off the hills as the wagon bumped along. Let them stare, she once said. At least we stare back. And when the show was over, and the tent came down, and the horses were fed, she curled up in his arms under the stars and slept like any wife would. Safe, loved, tired from a long day's work. Let's close this chapter here, at the edge of a field, where campfires glow and the grass sways gently. Inside a covered wagon, Elias the serpent man lies on his side, murmuring a lullaby his mother once sang, something about a fox and a river and a bundle of reeds. The world, so full of noise in daylight, has gone quiet. He is no longer a marvel, no longer a monster, he is just a man, sleeping as all men do. The year is 1651. The smell of beeswax candles and musty velvet curtains fills a quiet study. In the dim golden glow, a man in a powdered wig carefully unlocks a tall walnut cabinet, its doors creaking open like an ancient chapel. Inside, on silk-lined shelves, lie strange things: preserved beetles the size of spoons, a tiny shrunken skull, a bird's egg etched with Latin scripture, and then, tucked gently in the corner, encased in a jar of alcohol, a malformed human fetus. It is the beginning of a new era, the age of wonder, observation, and classification. And with it, the human freak is no longer just a jester or a traveling act. Now, they are something more chilling, a specimen. These were the days of the Cabinet of Curiosities, also known in Latin as Wunderkammer, a kind of proto-museum found in the homes of wealthy noblemen, scholars, or eccentric collectors. They housed the rarest, strangest, and most astonishing objects their owners could find: the natural, the supernatural, the bizarre, a pickled merman, a petrified hand, a man with 4 nipples, and in the very back, standing nervously in the shadows, a living person, an example of rare anatomy, a guest, a display, a prisoner, a curiosity. Let us meet one such figure. Her name is Sabina. She stands just over 3 feet tall, her limbs unusually long for her body, giving her a spidery silhouette. She has been hired, though never quite told for what, to live in the estate of a German botanist named Dr. Roos. He studies bones and flowers, she says softly, turning a silver spoon in her hands. He once asked me to smile so he could measure the width of my teeth. Sabina does not perform. She is not part of a tent or fair. She is observed, invited to sit at the edge of dinners, brought into lectures with silent introductions, nodded at during polite academic debates. They speak of me, she says, rare this, unique that. Once I heard the word mutation. I pretended not to understand, but I did. During this period, science was blossoming, but so were assumptions. The early anatomists and natural philosophers had begun cataloguing everything: shells, stones, species, people, as if the world was a grand filing cabinet waiting to be sorted. And so those with unusual appearances were drafted into the taxonomy of spectacle. Some, like Sabina, lived quietly in scholars' homes. Others were drawn into anatomical theatres, where they stood on rotating stages while a professor lectured about their proportions, not unlike an early PowerPoint slide. In Leiden, Amsterdam, and Florence, great halls were built for these lectures: tall domes, tired seats, dozens, sometimes hundreds of students. At the center, a human being, often stripped nearly bare, as the audience leaned forward, pencils scribbling. Sometimes, the performer was asked to smile, or turn, or walk in a circle. The applause, if any, was gentle and clinical. One such man, named Willem, had an unusually large skull and a curved spine. He was displayed in the anatomical theatre at the University of Padua in 1678. They asked me to kneel, he would later recall, not for reverence, but for measurement. I saw their eyes flick between awe and pity. I smiled anyway. Better a well-behaved specimen than a dismissed one. This was the new reality of the freak show: part science, part theatre, part cold detachment. Outside of universities, curiosity shops grew popular. Think of a medieval apothecary blended with a magician's closet. Behind smudged windows were wax heads, animal bones, fake unicorn horns, and occasionally, real people available for viewing. There were men with tails, women with 4 breasts, boys with webbed feet, a girl with skin as pale as parchment, who blinked twice and was called the living angel. She was in fact just albinistic, a child named Clara, from rural Saxony, who wanted to be a baker. Instead, she stood 6 hours a day in a white robe while strangers paid pennies to look at her hands. Still, not all who entered these cabinets were treated as objects. Some became masters of their own displays. A man named Matthias Buyinger, born in 1674 without hands or legs below the thigh, became a sensation in Germany. He was not exhibited by force, he performed by choice. He could write calligraphy, play multiple instruments, and perform magic tricks. He would draw entire biblical scenes so small they fit on a coin, using only his shoulder stumps and a brush attached to a belt. His posters called him the Wonder of Leipzig. He called himself a man who does what you cannot. Boulanger controlled his image. He sold autographs. He cracked jokes. He lived until 65 and fathered over a dozen children. In an era where many with his condition died young or were sold into shows, he crafted a brand. But Boulanger was an exception. Most marvels of this time had no control. They were placed into drawers and jars, both literally and metaphorically, measured, labeled, displayed, sometimes even in death. In the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in London, there sat for years the skeleton of a man with severe dwarfism, posed upright, labeled with cool numbers, and gazed upon by generations of medical students. His name, lost, unrecorded. His story, unknown. His life, reduced to measurements of femurs and skull curvature. We don't know whether he preferred poetry or silence, whether he liked figs, whether he had a soft spot for singing birds, and yet he was once a living man, someone who walked unevenly, who yawned in the morning, who maybe told terrible jokes. Tonight, in the warm light of your quiet room, as you drift slowly into sleep, imagine him not as a skeleton in a case, but as a person, dressed in a woolen vest, sitting by a fire, scratching a name into a piece of soft bark, humming something old, and just being old, and just being old. Let us now walk into the heart of a bustling city, New York perhaps, or London, in the year 1872. The air smells of coal and horse manure. The streets buzz with carriages and men shouting the headlines. Somewhere not far off, a brass band toots a marching tune, and above the noise, a painted banner flaps in the breeze. Come one, come all, the greatest marvels the world has ever seen. This is the golden age of the freak show, and at its center is a name as legendary as any king or conqueror, P.T. Barnum. To some he was a genius, a showman without equal. To others, a master of manipulation. But to the people he displayed, some of whom owed their entire careers to his stage, he was something even stranger, an opportunity. Let's peek inside the doors of Barnum's American Museum, the crown jewel of 19th century spectacle. It's loud, crowded, smells faintly of popcorn and gas lamps. On one floor, wax figures of criminals. On another, preserved animals in jars. Above, a lecture on phrenology. And then finally, a thick curtain hides the most anticipated display of all, the human curiosities. And there they are, in full makeup and elaborate costumes, a bearded lady smiling sweetly, a man standing 8 feet tall in polished boots, a pair of conjoined twins bowing in perfect unison, a woman with tattooed skin said to be rescued from savages. Behind them, a man without limbs who lights a cigar with his teeth, a dwarf in a soldier's uniform, doing somersaults, a giantess holding a parasol in delicate hands. They were introduced with flair, the living skeleton, the alligator boy, the human caterpillar. Audiences gasped, clapped, even whistled, and while some performers smiled and waved, grateful for the applause, others just endured. Let us meet one of them. Her name is Lenora, though the posters call her Madame Hydra. She has a condition that caused excess skin to fold around her arms and back, giving her a lizard-like appearance. Her eyes are gentle, her voice quiet. They told me I'd be a star, she says backstage, adjusting her shawl. And maybe I am, but stars don't sleep on straw in a closet. The crowds stare and call me brave, but they don't know the names I'm called after dark. Still, it's a living. For many performers of the time, it was a living better than begging, better than hiding. They could earn a wage, travel, even send money home, but the cost was steep. They were owned in all but name. Barnum was known for sensationalizing. Joyce Heth, the enslaved woman he claimed was 161 years old, and George Washington's nursemaid, Chang and Ing, the famous conjoined twins, advertised as Siamese wonders, and Tom Thumb, the beloved dwarf who played Napoleon, knights and kings in elaborate miniature costumes. Barnum wrote their lines, chose their names, sometimes even fabricated their entire biographies. And yet, not all resented him. Charles Stratton, better known as Tom Thumb, became rich, married Lavinia Warren, another performer, in a wedding so grand that it was covered by newspapers around the world. President Lincoln hosted them at the White House. They rode in gold-plated carriages, but even in luxury, the show followed. They spent their honeymoon being watched. At night they whispered to each other in candlelight, hoping someday they'd be left alone just once, to be small and unseen. Behind the spectacle, there were quieter lives. Joseph Merrick, known cruelly as the Elephant Man, was exhibited across England for the better part of a decade. Born with extreme physical deformities, he was eventually taken in by a doctor named Frederick Treves, who offered him comfort and privacy. Joseph wrote poetry, loved books, hated being stared at. He once said, "I am not an animal, I am a human being." And when the crowds finally stopped knocking, Joseph Merrick lived his final days in a private room, watching the world through a small window. No signs, no curtains, just sky. Back in the museum, the performers gather after hours. Some take off wigs, others wipe away heavy grease paint. A few joke over lukewarm tea. There's George the Frog Boy, whose joints don't bend right. He practices piano with his knuckles. There's Delia, the tattooed lady, who reads Shakespeare by candlelight, and Miguel the dog-faced man, who knits scarves for winter. Their lives may be exaggerated on stage, but behind it they are ordinary in the most beautiful ways. They fall in love, argue, get stage fright, miss home, sleep late, dream of different lives. Yet when the curtain lifts, they become legends again. The stage lights burn hot, the music swells, the ringmaster bellows, "Step right up, ladies and gentlemen, and see the impossible," and the impossible steps forward. But the applause always fades. The crowd leaves. And in the quiet after the spectacle, the truth returns. The performers are tired, their backs ache, their costumes itch. Some go home to family, others to rented rooms with a single candle and a view of brick. They hang up their monikers. Let the makeup flake away. They are not monsters. They never were. They are just people. And tonight, as they lie down in creaky beds, the city hums quietly around them. The circus is sleeping too. The wagons are covered. The lights are dimmed. The marvels have removed their masks. And somewhere in the stillness of early dawn, you might hear the soft, even breath of a legend at rest. The year is 1889. The world is changing. Steel stretches skyward, steamships carve the oceans, and electricity buzzes like lightning bottled in wire. In Paris, crowds gather in the thousands to marvel at the exposition universe, the World's Fair. There is laughter, music, innovation. A tower of metal rises into the sky, a strange new monument named after Gustave Eiffel. And in the far corner of the fairgrounds, away from the glowing pavilions of industry, lies a fenced enclosure. It's filled with thatched huts, mud paths, palm fronds, strange sounds, bare feet. This is not a stage. It's a human zoo. Real people, brought from across oceans, villagers, children, dancers, chiefs, sit behind low railings while crowds point, gawk, and whisper. They are not here as guests. They are not here as performers. They are here to be looked at. This was not some rare cruelty. From the late 1800s into the early 20th century, dozens of major cities, Paris, London, Hamburg, New York, Brussels, erected ethnological exhibitions. Sometimes they were called colonial villages, native camps, or primitive displays. The names were different. The purpose was the same: to show that other people were not quite people, to place human beings on the same level as animals and artifacts, and to let Western eyes roam without guilt. Let us walk through one such exhibit. It's Berlin, 1896. The air is damp with autumn rain. The city is proud. The fairgrounds are full. In the middle of the Tierpark, a temporary village has been constructed. Bamboo poles, woven mats, smoke pits, and there, seated under a makeshift awning, is a young girl. Her name is Ajara. She is 10 years old, from Senegal. She sits cross-legged on a reed mat, wearing a tunic of coarse cloth. They ask me to smile, she says softly in her native tongue, but my brother is sick. The water here makes him ill. Each morning we are given fruit and told to dance. I do not want to dance. I want to go home. Ajara has been told this is for education, that people wish to learn, but she does not see students. She sees faces peering over fences. She hears laughter. She feels cold in the German wind. At night she dreams of mango trees and the rhythm of drums. She is on display, and she is not alone. In the same enclosure are elders who have never seen a steam engine, now sitting near one. A healer woman holding dried herbs, her arms crossed in quiet defiance. A boy who tried to climb the fence and was stopped gently, but firmly by guards. They are not performers, they are prisoners of spectacle. Across Europe and America, similar displays were created. In London's Crystal Palace, a so-called African court was built, where West African men and women were asked to forge tools and speak in unfamiliar languages, while ladies in corsets and gentlemen with walking sticks sipped tea and jotted notes. In New York's Bronx Zoo, an indigenous man named Ota Benga was placed in a cage beside an orangutan in 1906. He had been brought from the Congo, orphaned by colonial violence, and told he would be educated. Instead, he was paraded, compared to an animal, described in newspapers as half man, half monkey. And when protest finally came, it came not from the crowds, but from black clergy, who demanded his release. Ota Benga was eventually freed. He never returned to Africa. In time he died by suicide. History remembers his name now, but how many others never got even that? Let's go back to Paris, to 1931. The Colonial Exhibition, a massive affair. The idea was to show the global reach of the French Empire, and so whole villages were recreated. Algerian cafes, Vietnamese homes, Congolese tribal squares. Actors, no, real people, real lives, living day after day in artificial recreations of their own worlds, for the entertainment of strangers. Signs describe them like animals. Observe their customs, note the natural rhythm in their speech, the simplicity of their lives, never once noting their sadness, their fear, their confusion. We imagine them not through postcards, not through black and white photographs, but through silence. At night, the drums stop, the fires are low. Behind the bamboo fencing, a family gathers in a hut. The father rubs a sore shoulder from chopping ceremonial wood all day. The mother combs her daughter's hair gently. The little boy curls up with a wool blanket, brought by a French. He cannot sleep. The city buzzes beyond the fence. He misses the sound of crickets in his real home. He asks when they can go back. His mother says, soon, but she doesn't know if that's true. Some of these villages were brought with promises. Others were coerced. Some were children too young to understand why cameras kept flashing. They were told they were ambassadors of culture, but they were given no voice. Sometimes, even death did not end the display. Sarah Bartman, known cruelly as the Hottentot Venus, was paraded through Europe for her body. Even after her death in 1815, her remains were preserved, dissected, and displayed in museums for over a century. She came from the Khoikhoi people of South Africa. She sang lullabies in her native tongue, laughed with cousins, wove baskets. She was 20 when taken abroad. She died at 25. Her skeleton, brain and genitals were placed on show in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. It took until 2002, nearly 200 years later, for her body to be returned to her homeland for a proper burial. Today her grave is simple, quiet, and finally unseen. In the darkest corners of the freak show world, it wasn't deformity that drew crowds. It was difference, cultural, racial, linguistic. People weren't just stared at for their limbs. They were stared at for being foreign, being brown, being other. And that is what made it worse than any circus. Because you could take off a costume, you could walk off a stage, but you could not take off your skin. Let's leave this chapter now, with the memory of a girl named Ajara, who once danced behind a fence in Berlin. It is evening. She sits alone, clutching a worn rag doll made from old cloth. The lanterns beyond the enclosure are going out. Somewhere, a phonograph crackles with the final notes of a lullaby. She is not smiling, she is simply waiting. And the world outside, finally is stilled. Finally is stilled. The lights dim. The crowd thins. The applause has faded. And when the banners are folded and the makeup wiped away, what's left? This chapter is not about grand exhibitions or glittering museums. It's not about history as written in textbooks or painted on circus wagons. This is about what happened after the curtain fell, the long, quiet spaces where the marvels of the world sat with their own thoughts. Because behind every nickname, every costume, every poster, was a human being living the long, complicated stretch of a life. Let us wander now, slowly and gently, through those unseen moments. The bearded lady and her mirror. Her name was Rosamond, but the crowds knew her as the lady with the chin of a czar. Her beard was soft and full, dark as ink, and her gowns were always impeccable. But every night, after the final bow, Rosamond would return to a tiny room above the tent. She would sit at her mirror, remove her rings, untie the corset. Then she would look at herself. "They say I'm brave," she whispered one evening, stroking her own cheek. "But bravery is just another word for waking up again. I like the beard, not because it makes me different, but because it's mine." She never married. She never needed to. She loved her garden, her books, her quiet, and sometimes when she passed a mirror in the morning light, she would wink at herself and say, "Rosie, you are the most curious miracle this side of the stars." The living skeleton and the extra bowl of soup. There was a man named Theo, born so thin his ribs looked like branches and his neck like a swan's. He toured for decades as the human skeleton, wearing tuxedos that hung like sails and eating bread slowly so crowds could see how little it took to fill him. But Theo had a secret. He loved soup. Thick, hearty, creamy soup. He didn't always eat it. His body couldn't hold much, but he loved the smell, the warmth of it in a bowl, the steam on his face. His dresser, a kindly older man named Franklin, used to bring him soup just so Theo could hold it. "Smells like home," Theo would whisper. And in the coldest cities when the snow packed against the tent flaps and the audience was lean, that soup was the one thing that made him feel full, even if only in spirit. He died in a warm bed, holding Franklin's hand, and beside him, a bowl of potato leek soup, still steaming. The boy who never touched the ground, Alfie, was born without legs. His arms were long and strong, his smile infectious. Billed as the crawling marvel, he would race across the stage using only his hands, vaulting through hoops and balancing plates on his head. But Alfie hated being low. He used to dream of rooftops, trees, bridges, anywhere he could see the world from above. So one year, when the fair set up beside a hill, Alfie crawled slowly, not on stage, but up the grass, to the very top. It took him 2 hours. He sat at the peak, breathless, laughing. "The world looks kinder from up here," he said to no one. He sat for hours, the wind in his hair, the clouds rolling like ships overhead. When the show packed up days later, the townspeople said they'd seen a boy flying without wings. They were right. He just wasn't in the tent that night. The twins who whispered different dreams, conjoined twins Bella and Mireille, shared everything. A liver, a spine, a small stage in a traveling cabaret. But their dreams, oh, those were different. Bella longed for the ocean. Mireille wanted to be a writer. They made a game of it. Bella would close one eye and pretend she was looking at the sea. Mireille would close the other and imagine the scratching of a pen on parchment. They shared meals, shared books, shared silence, but their souls, they carved 2 entire universes between them. Once, after a storm cancelled a show, they sat by candlelight under a tarp. "Do you think we'll ever see the ocean?" Bella asked. "I already have," Mireille whispered, tapping her forehead. "I see it every night in your dreams." They never separated. They never needed to. The last day of the last giant martin, known as the Mountain, stood nearly 9 feet tall in his boots. Crowds came just to walk beneath him. They'd gasp when he entered a room. But in his later years, Martin's back bent. His legs ached. He grew quiet. One spring morning, in a small village, he told the showmaster, "I think I'm done." Done with what? With being taller than the sky. He left the stage that day. No parade, no speech. He moved to a farm, grew tomatoes, adopted a dog so small it fit in his coat pocket, and every night, before sleep, he sat on the porch and looked at the stars, finally not the tallest thing around. And then there was silence. All these lives, all these names, some known, some lost, each with their own quiet heartbreaks, their own moments of joy, their own reasons for stepping into the spotlight, and one day stepping out. Some were celebrated, others forgotten. But they all share one simple truth: they were human. And when the applause faded, and the crowd disappeared, and the stage went dark, they went home, laid their heads on pillows, and just like you, they dreamed. And now we arrive at the edge of the stage, the final act, the curtain trembling, ready to fall, but not with a roar, not with gasps or clapping. It ends with a whisper. You see, the freak show didn't vanish in a single moment. It faded, like all things from another time, quietly, uneasily, almost reluctantly. In the early 20th century, the world began to change, slowly at first, but change is like rain, soft at the start, and then suddenly the streets are soaked. Science began to speak in new terms, words like genetics, congenital disorder, disability rights. Understanding deepened, sympathy replaced superstition, and with this came a strange new sensation in the hearts of audiences: discomfort. Where once they laughed, now they hesitated. Where once they marveled, they now felt a quiet shame. By the 1940s and 1950s, laws began to shift. Public exhibitions of people based on deformity were banned in many countries. In the United States, states like Michigan, New York and Pennsylvania passed legislation prohibiting freak shows altogether. It was no longer considered entertainment. It was seen at last for what it was: exploitation. The circus responded. Some shows tried to adapt. They called their performers stars. They gave them fancier titles, more respectful language, but the magic was gone, or rather the illusion. Fewer and fewer came to watch, and those who did, whispered. One by one, the tents stopped going up. The wagons stopped rolling. The wagons stopped rolling. The stages were folded. The banners, faded with sun, were packed into dusty trunks and never reopened. And the performers, they moved on. Some found new lives: teachers, artists, poets. Some opened shops. Some returned home. Some stayed in the towns that once watched them and built quiet, peaceful lives. The last of the great sideshows limped into the 1970s. In 1981, the legendary Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus retired its sideshow division altogether. It was the end of an era. The lights dimmed, the last coin fell, and the final voice said, "Thank you, that's enough." But not all was lost. Something strange happened in the years after the end, a sort of rebirth, not of the freak show but of its people. They began to tell their own stories. Memoirs were written, interviews conducted, documentaries filmed, portraits painted, not of monsters or marvels but of individuals. Historians unearthed forgotten names. Curators removed offensive plaques. Graves that once went unmarked were honored with proper headstones. And slowly, the freaks so long trapped in glass jars and yellowing posters were returned to their humanity. They were remembered not as oddities, but as artists, as pioneers, as survivors. Tonight we remember them too, not the names shouted by barkers, not the labels printed in red ink, but the quiet names whispered at dusk, the names they gave themselves, the names spoken only in lullabies and letters home, because every one of them, every marvel, every curiosity, every so-called freak, had a voice, had a heart, had a night where they looked up at the same stars you see now, and maybe, just maybe, asked the same quiet question: will I be remembered? You, lying here now, warm and safe, have given them your time, your attention, your empathy, and that is remembrance enough. So let's dim the lights one final time. The tent is quiet, the night is soft, and somewhere beyond the flicker of the final torch, the old stage creaks no more. The marvels are gone, but they are not forgotten. Close your eyes now, if they're not closed already. Let the past settle like dust on a closed book, and drift into rest, knowing you've honored the forgotten. One breath at a time, one story at a time. Good night.